The howl of a coyote echoed across the vast Wyoming prairie as Preston Xavier slumped in his saddle, the weight of exhaustion bearing down on his broad shoulders. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving frontier had taken nearly everything from him, everything except the tiny bundle nestled in the makeshift sling across his chest. His daughter, merely 3 months old, slept soundly despite the rugged terrain and the approaching dusk that threatened to swallow them whole. "Just a little further, Elizabeth," Preston whispered to his child, his voice hoarse from days of riding. His wife, Sarah, had died bringing their daughter into this world, leaving him alone to navigate fatherhood in a land where survival itself was a daily victory. The distant glow of lanterns pierced the twilight, signaling the small settlement of Riverstone. Preston had heard tales of this place, a growing town with opportunities for a man willing to work hard. After months of drifting, following Sarah's passing, he'd made the decision to find somewhere stable for his daughter. As he approached the main street, the town revealed itself, a collection of wooden structures, a general store, saloon, and scattered residences. Nothing grand, but to a man who'd been sleeping under stars for too long, it looked like paradise. "Whoa!" Preston pulled his chestnut mare to a halt outside the town's only hotel, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sign that swung gently in the evening breeze. The baby stirred against his chest, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of the woolen blanket. A young stable boy came running to take his horse. "Evening, mister. Staying the night," Preston nodded, carefully dismounting while supporting Elizabeth with one arm. "And maybe longer if there's work to be found." The boy took the reins. "Town's growing, always need for strong hands." Inside the hotel, the warmth of a crackling fire greeted them, a welcome change from the chilly spring air outside. Behind the front desk, a woman in her 40s looked up from her ledger, her eyes immediately drawn to the baby. "My goodness," she said, setting down her pencil. "You look like you've ridden through hell itself." Preston managed a weary smile. "Feels that way, madam. Need a room for me and my daughter." The woman's expression softened. "Name's Mrs. Thornton. I own this establishment." She moved around the desk, peering at the sleeping infant. "And who's this little angel?" "Elizabeth Xavier," Preston replied, shifting the baby slightly so Mrs. Thornton could see her face. 3 months old. Mrs. Thornton's brow furrowed, and her mother, Preston's jaw tightened, buried back in Colorado territory, understanding flashed in Mrs. Thornton's eyes. "I've got a room at the end of the hall upstairs, quietest one we have." She hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind my asking, how are you managing with an infant?" Preston looked down at Elizabeth, her peaceful face a stark contrast to the chaos of the past months. "One day at a time, madam. Got no choice but to keep moving forward." "You'll need proper supplies," Mrs. Thornton said decisively. "Milk, clean cloths. When's the last time this child had a proper bath?" The question struck Preston like a physical blow. He'd been doing his best, but his best felt woefully inadequate. "Been using what I could find, trading for milk at farms when possible." Mrs. Thornton nodded, a plan clearly forming in her mind. "Get yourself settled. I'll send up some hot water and something for you both to eat. And tomorrow you ought to visit Bridget Grayson at the general store. She might be able to help with what you need for the little one." Preston felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. I'm much obliged." Once in the room, Preston gently laid Elizabeth on the bed, surrounding her with pillows to prevent her from rolling. The room was simple but clean, a far cry from their recent accommodations. He sat beside his daughter, watching her chest rise and fall with each tiny breath. "We might have found a place to stay a while, Lizzie," he whispered, using the nickname he'd given her. "Just need to find work, get us settled proper." As promised, Mrs. Thornton sent up hot water, a simple stew, and fresh bread. Preston ate quickly, then carefully bathed Elizabeth, who awoke during the process and regarded him with wide, curious eyes that mirrored her mother's. "There now," he said, wrapping her in a clean towel Mrs. Thornton had provided. "That's better, isn't it?" Elizabeth's response was a toothless grin that made Preston's heart clench. Moments like these were precious reminders of why he kept pushing forward when grief threatened to consume him. The following morning, after a night of actual rest interrupted only by Elizabeth's feeding schedule, Preston made his way to the general store. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, Elizabeth once again secured in the sling across his chest. The store was well stocked, shelves lined with goods from canned peaches to bolts of fabric. A young woman stood behind the counter, arranging a display of ribbons. She looked up at the sound of the bell, and Preston was struck by her appearance, warm brown eyes that seemed to smile before her lips did. Honey blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and a practical blue dress that couldn't hide the graceful way she moved. "Good morning," she greeted, her eyes immediately drawn to the baby. "You must be the newcomers Mrs. Thornton mentioned." Preston nodded, adjusting his hat respectfully. "Preston Xavier, madam, and this is my daughter, Elizabeth, Bridget Grayson," she replied, coming around the counter. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the baby. Preston hesitated only briefly before carefully extracting Elizabeth from the sling. Bridget took the baby with practiced ease, cradling her in a way that spoke of experience. "Hello there, little one," she cooed, earning another of Elizabeth's gummy smiles. "Oh, she's absolutely darling, Mr. Xavier." "Preston, please," he said, watching the interaction with a mixture of relief and something else he couldn't quite name. Bridget looked up, meeting his gaze. "Mrs. Thornton said you might need some supplies for the baby." "That's right," Preston confirmed. "Been on the trail too long, need proper things for her." Bridget nodded, still holding Elizabeth. "I can help with that. My sister had 4 little ones and I helped raise them all after her husband was killed at Shiloh." A shadow crossed her face momentarily before she continued, "I know what babies need." Over the next hour, Bridget helped Preston select essential items. Soft cotton cloths for diapers, a special bottle with a rubber nipple that was easier for babies to use, goat's milk that she assured him was gentler on infant stomachs than cow's milk, and a small wooden cradle that had been sitting in the storeroom. Previous owner ordered it for his wife, but they moved on before it arrived, Bridget explained. "It's been gathering dust for months." Preston ran his hand over the smooth wood. "It's fine craftsmanship." "It is," Bridget agreed, "and every baby deserves a proper place to sleep." When it came time to settle the bill, Preston reached for the money pouch tied to his belt, concern etching lines around his eyes. Bridget seemed to sense his worry. "We can arrange credit if needed," she offered quietly. "Once you've found work," Preston straightened his shoulders. "I appreciate that, Miss Grayson, but I can pay, just need to be careful until I find steady work." Bridget nodded, respecting his pride. "The mill on the edge of town is hiring. My brother-in-law Frank manages it. I could put in a word." Hope flickered in Preston's chest. "That would be mighty kind of you." As Bridget calculated his purchases, Elizabeth began to fuss. Preston reached for her, but Bridget shook her head. "Let me show you a trick," she said, adjusting the baby against her shoulder and patting her back rhythmically. Within moments, Elizabeth let out a tiny burp and settled. "There we go, she just needed to release some air." Preston watched in amazement. "You're good with her." A soft smile played at Bridget's lips. "I've had practice." She handed Elizabeth back to Preston, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Stop by the mill tomorrow morning. I'll tell Frank to expect you." Preston left the store with his purchases, including the cradle which the store's young assistant helped carry back to the hotel. That night, as he placed Elizabeth in her new bed, he found himself thinking about Bridget Grayson, her kindness, her ease with his daughter, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "What do you think, Lizzie?" he whispered to his drowsy daughter. "Think we might have found somewhere to belong." The next morning, Preston made arrangements with Mrs. Thornton. She agreed to watch Elizabeth while he went to the mill, assuring him that she had raised 3 boys of her own and was more than capable of minding an infant for a few hours. "Besides," she added with a knowing look, "it'll do you good to speak with adults without a baby strapped to your chest." The lumber mill sat on the banks of the river that gave Riverstone its name. The sound of saws and the smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air as Preston approached. A broad-shouldered man with a thick beard was directing workers as they maneuvered logs onto the cutting platform. "You Frank," Preston called out, approaching the man. The foreman turned, sizing Preston up with a quick glance. I am, you must be Xavier. Bridget sent word you'd be coming. Preston extended his hand. Looking for work if you're hiring. Frank's handshake was firm. Always need good men. Bridget says you're handy and reliable. Preston raised an eyebrow. She said that, did she? A smile cracked through Frank's beard. Not in so many words, but she doesn't send men my way unless she thinks they're worth something. He gestured toward the mill. Can you handle yourself around machinery? Got a strong back? Yes to both, Preston replied confidently. Then you can start today. Pays fair, work is hard. We cut timber 6 days a week, sunup to sundown with an hour break at midday. Preston considered the schedule, thinking of Elizabeth. I've got my daughter to consider, no mother to care for her. Frank nodded, understanding. Riverstone looks after its own, between Mrs. Thornton, Bridget, and the other women in town. I'm sure arrangements can be made. He paused. Bridget mentioned your situation. Lost my own wife years back. It's not easy, but it gets more bearable. The unexpected empathy caught Preston off guard. Thank you, he managed. By the end of the day, Preston's muscles ached in a way that only honest work could produce. He'd proven himself capable, learning quickly and working efficiently. Frank had seemed pleased, confirming that the job was his if he wanted it. When he returned to the hotel, tired but satisfied, he found Elizabeth not with Mrs. Thornton but with Bridget Grayson, who sat in a rocking chair near the fire in the small lobby, the baby sleeping contentedly in her arms. Miss Grayson, Preston said, surprised. Bridget looked up, a soft smile illuminating her face. Mrs. Thornton had some business to attend to. I offered to step in. She nodded toward his dusty clothes. I see Frank put you to work right away. That he did, Preston confirmed, lowering himself into a chair across from her, muscles protesting. Offered me the position permanent. That's wonderful news, Bridget said sincerely. Frank doesn't offer jobs to just anyone. Preston studied her for a moment. Thank you for your help. With the job, with Elizabeth, with everything. Bridget's cheeks colored slightly. It's nothing. Riverstone takes care of its own, as you'll discover. She glanced down at the sleeping baby. She's been an angel, took her bottle well, barely fussed at all. A question formed in Preston's mind. Miss Grayson, I find myself in need of someone to look after Elizabeth while I'm working. Would you happen to know anyone suitable? Bridget met his gaze steadily. As it happens, I do. The store is quiet most mornings. I could mind her until midday, and Mrs. Thornton has already offered to take afternoons. Preston blinked in surprise. I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't ask, I offered, Bridget pointed out. Besides, it would be my pleasure. It's been too long since I've had a little one to fuss over. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Preston would bring Elizabeth to the general store each morning, where Bridget would care for her while attending to customers. At midday, Mrs. Thornton would collect the baby, allowing Bridget to focus on the store's busy afternoon hours. Preston would retrieve his daughter each evening, often finding time to sit and talk with Bridget before heading back to the hotel. As spring gave way to summer, Preston began building a small cabin on a plot of land at the edge of town that he'd purchased with his savings. Frank and other men from the mill helped during their off hours, and even Bridget contributed, selecting fabrics for curtains and offering practical suggestions about the layout. One warm evening in July, as Preston worked on the cabin's porch, Bridget arrived with Elizabeth in her arms and a basket over her elbow. Thought you might be hungry, she called out, approaching the half-finished structure. Preston set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow. That's mighty thoughtful of you, Bridget smiled, looking around at the cabin. It's really coming along. You'll be moved in before the first frost. That's the plan, Preston agreed, taking Elizabeth from her arms. The baby, now 7 months old, had grown considerably, her dark hair forming tiny curls around her face. She reached for her father's beard, giggling when he pretended to nibble her fingers. Bridget spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked her basket, fried chicken, corn bread, and fresh berries. They sat together in the lengthening shadows, eating and talking while Elizabeth played with wooden blocks that Frank had carved for her. She's trying to stand, Bridget observed as Elizabeth pulled herself up against a stump, wobbling precariously before plopping back down. Preston nodded proudly. Won't be long before she's walking, then I'll really have my hands full. Children grow up so fast, Bridget said, a wistful note in her voice. My nephew Thomas was just her age when I started caring for him. Now he's 14 and taller than I am. Preston studied her profile in the golden evening light. You ever think of having children of your own? The question hung between them, more intimate than any they'd shared before. Bridget's eyes met his, something vulnerable in their depths. I always assumed I would, she admitted, but life had other plans. My sister needed me after her husband died, and then my parents fell ill. She shrugged lightly. By the time they passed, I was already considered a spinster by most folks' reckoning. Nonsense, Preston said firmly. You're young yet. A smile touched her lips. I'm 28, Preston, not exactly a blushing bride. Age is just numbers, he countered. What matters is the heart. The conversation shifted to other topics, but something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that neither had dared voice before. As summer faded into autumn, Preston completed the cabin and moved in with Elizabeth. The single room was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a small table with chairs, a bed for Preston, and Elizabeth's cradle positioned beside it. Bridget helped him settle in, bringing a quilt she'd sewn from scraps and hanging the curtains she'd made. The place transformed from a mere structure to a home under her touch. One evening, as Preston sat beside Elizabeth's cradle, gently rocking it as he often did until she fell asleep, a knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find Bridget standing there, a concerned expression on her face. Everything all right? He asked, stepping back to let her in. Yes, she paused, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. I realized I'd forgotten to bring the medicine I promised for when Elizabeth is teething. She held up a small bottle. It's a mixture of chamomile and willow bark. My mother's recipe? Preston took the bottle gratefully. Thank you, she's been fussy lately. I suspect another tooth is coming in. Bridget moved to the cradle, where Elizabeth lay awake but quiet, watching the shadows from the fire dance across the ceiling. Hello, sweet girl, she whispered, stroking the baby's cheek. Preston watched them, a realization dawning that had been building for months. Bridget wasn't just helping with Elizabeth out of kindness, she loved his daughter as if she were her own. And he? Well, he had come to love Bridget in a way he hadn't thought possible after Sarah. Would you like some coffee? He offered, breaking the silence. Bridget straightened. I should be getting back. It's getting late, and please, Preston said softly, stay a while. Something in his tone made her pause. She nodded, slipping off her shawl and draping it over the back of a chair. They sat at the small table, steam rising from their cups as the fire crackled in the hearth. Elizabeth's breathing had deepened into sleep, her tiny snores barely audible. I've been thinking, Preston began, his fingers tapping nervously against his cup, about the future, about what's best for Elizabeth. Bridget's expression grew guarded. Are you planning to move on? No, he said quickly. Riverstone is our home now. I've put down roots here. He drew a deep breath. But Elizabeth needs more than just a father. She needs a mother's touch, a woman's guidance as she grows. Bridget's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I've watched you with her, Preston went on. The way you care for her, the love you show her, it's more than I could have hoped for. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I know it might seem sudden, but these past months, Bridget, I've come to care for you deeply. Color rose in Bridget's cheeks. Preston, you don't have to answer now, he interrupted. I know it's a lot to consider, taking on a ready-made family, a man who's still healing from loss. He swallowed hard. But I want you to know that my feelings are genuine, and if there's any chance you might someday feel the same. Bridget's fingers entwined with his. I already do, she whispered. I've been falling in love with both of you for months. Relief and joy washed over Preston's face. Then would you consider becoming part of our family? Not right away, we can take time, court properly if that's what you want. But someday, Bridget's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I would be honored. The winter months brought them closer. Preston and Bridget courted properly, taking Sunday walks with Elizabeth bundled against the cold, sharing meals with friends and learning each other's stories. Bridget spoke of her childhood in Ohio, her journey west with her family after the war, and the losses that had shaped her. Preston shared memories of Sarah, his life as a ranch hand before Elizabeth's birth, and his dreams for their future. As winter's grip began to loosen, Preston took Bridget to a special spot by the river, Elizabeth secure in his arms. The first wildflowers were pushing through the soil, and the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the landscape. "I have something for you," Preston said, reaching into his pocket after setting Elizabeth on a blanket with her favorite toys. Bridget watched as he withdrew a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. "It's beautiful," she said, taking it from him. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl set in its center. "It was my mother's," Preston explained, "the only thing of value I have from my family." Bridget looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "Preston," he took her hand in his. "Bridget Grayson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of being a mother to Elizabeth and, God willing, more children in the years to come?" Tears spilled down Bridget's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she breathed. "With all my heart, yes." They were married in the small church in Riverstone as spring blossomed around them. Elizabeth, now almost a year old, was passed between Mrs. Thornton and Frank during the ceremony, her happy babbling providing a soundtrack to their vows. The town celebrated with them, turning the wedding into a community affair with tables of food, music, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. As darkness fell, the newlyweds returned to their cabin, now expanded with a second room that Preston and Frank had built in preparation for their marriage. Elizabeth was already asleep when they arrived home, exhausted from the day's excitement. Preston gently placed her in her cradle, which had been moved to its own corner of the main room, giving the couple some privacy in their bedroom. As he sat beside the cradle, watching his daughter sleep peacefully, Bridget came to stand behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "She looks like an angel," Bridget whispered. Preston reached up to cover one of her hands with his own. "She is just like her mother was," he paused, "and just like her new mother is." Bridget knelt beside him, her wedding dress rustling softly. "I promise to love her as my own, Preston. To guide her, to teach her, to be there for her always." Preston turned to face his new wife, taking both her hands in his. "I know you will, you already have been." He drew a shaky breath. "When Sarah died, I thought my heart died with her. I never imagined I could love again, that I could find someone who would love not only me but my child as well." Bridget leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest sorrows," she said softly. "I had resigned myself to a life alone, believing my chance for love and family had passed me by. Then you rode into town with this precious girl, and everything changed." Preston cupped her face gently. "I love you, Bridget Xavier." "And I love you," she replied, the new name sounding right on her lips. As they shared a tender kiss, Elizabeth stirred in her cradle, making a soft cooing sound before settling back into sleep. Preston pulled back slightly, his gaze moving between his daughter and his wife. "I'll sit with her a bit longer," he said. "Old habit, can't seem to sleep unless I know she's settled for the night." Bridget smiled, understanding in her eyes. "I'll be waiting," she whispered, rising gracefully and moving toward their bedroom door. She paused, looking back at the tableau of father and daughter. "Preston," he looked up, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Yes, I'll raise her with you," Bridget said, her voice filled with quiet determination and love. "Every step of the way, through every joy and sorrow, every triumph and struggle, she'll know she's loved, that she has two parents who would move mountains for her." Preston felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I know you will," he managed. "We're a family now, all three of us." Bridget nodded, blowing a kiss toward Elizabeth's cradle before disappearing into their bedroom. Preston sat in the quiet, listening to his daughter's steady breathing and the soft sounds of his wife preparing for bed. A year ago, he had been a broken man, drifting without purpose beyond keeping his child alive. Now he was surrounded by love, rooted in a community that had embraced them, with a future brighter than he could have imagined. When Elizabeth was fully asleep, he rose and gently touched her downy hair. "Sweet dreams, Lizzie," he whispered. "Your mama's watching over you from heaven, and your new mama's right here with us. You're the luckiest little girl in the Wyoming territory." With that, he turned and walked toward the bedroom, toward Bridget, toward their future together, a future that had once seemed impossible but now stretched before them, full of promise and hope. In the years that followed, the Xavier family flourished. Elizabeth grew into a spirited young girl with her father's determination and her stepmother's compassion. She was joined by 2 brothers and a sister, filling their expanded cabin with laughter and the organized chaos that comes with a house full of children. Bridget continued to work at the general store, eventually purchasing it when the previous owner retired. Preston became foreman at the mill after Frank moved to Oregon, and their combined enterprises helped Riverstone grow into a proper town. On summer evenings, they would often sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the distant mountains. Preston would reach for Bridget's hand, their fingers entwining with the easy familiarity of deep love. "Did you ever imagine this?" He would sometimes ask, gesturing to their home, their children, the life they had built together, and Bridget would smile, remembering that moment by Elizabeth's cradle when she had promised to raise her with him. "Yes," she would answer truthfully. "From the moment I saw you with her, I imagined exactly this."